So, Shea, could you just begin by introducing yourself?
I'm Shea Howell, and I'm with the Boggs Center in Detroit and have been working on water issues since the early part of the Detroit bankruptcy process. Makes it about 6 years now.
So, we're going to be talking about water security and insecurity faced by Detroiters today. Can you tell us a little bit about what you mean or what you understand by water security?
Well, I think water security is a difficult term because it takes our attention away from what I think Detroiters have really fought to make clear, that water is a human right and it is a sacred trust. And those two notions have been the foundation of the struggles around water. And since then, we have seen the term water insecurity or water security emerge, which is really a polite way of saying some people are being denied a basic human right. They cannot have access to water because of their financial limitations.
Can you clarify on those two terms that you raised, sacred trust and human right?
Well, I think in some ways they should be self-evident, that a human right means you should not have to do anything to qualify or justify for access. Basic human rights are defined by the United Nations Charter, and one of those is an access to water. The United States, of course, has not endorsed that charter, and we have been very slow on the global scale of understanding what human rights are. But I think one of the important things about the Detroit struggle is it is raising for people to openly have conversations about what is a basic human right. What are our obligations to each other to make sure that all of us have at least some basic quality of life? As to the sacred trust, I think that one of the things that has happened in industrial societies is we have looked upon the earth as a disposable commodity, and in some cases as an infinite commodity. But what a sacred trust raises for us is this notion that we have a responsibility to preserve water, not just for ourselves, but for all future generations. That this is a living thing that requires care and thoughtfulness and some protection from us. That's why I think one of the major contributions of the struggle at Standing Rock was this notion that we are not water warriors, but we are water protectors. And that idea of protection flows from, no pun intended, but it flows from this idea that water is sacred, that it is a trust for all humans, for all life.
So, one of the things that we really want to focus on is the ongoing shutoffs in Detroit. And so I'd like to start at the beginning. Can you recount, reflect on how this sort of started to unfold or emerge around you? And this was way back in 2008 or so?
Well, that was the first sort of big wave. But
Right.
I mean, I think some of the things to think about are that Detroit has not had control of its own water since the late 1970s. Not because of anything anybody in Detroit did, but because of industrial pollution. And the fact that there was a very racist federal judge who simply refused to let Coleman Young have control of the water department. So it's been a long problem about how do we have effective municipal control over a basic municipal system that has been paid for over almost 2 centuries now.
And this was the EPA's ruling.
This was the EPA's ruling and Judge Fikens, and that's a long and complicated story, but the essence of it is pretty clear. The federal government appointed and was really basically responsible for control of municipal water. In that, Detroit's water was, the citizens of Detroit buy their water from or pay for their water as individual households. Now, when I first came to Detroit, we got a water bill once every 3 months, and that was a very modest bill. But as time went on, those bills escalated, and as time went on, we moved from this quarterly payment to monthly payment. But going into 2000, we started to see a significant increase in the water bills. And part of that was because the population by 2000 was almost 1/2 what it had been at the time when the federal government took over the water department. And what that means is you have an infrastructure built for 2 million people that now has to be supported by, at that point it was less than 1 million, and now it's only
700,000.
Yeah, pushing it to 700,000.
Right.
So you have, what that meant is that water bills, just to keep things at the level where they were, had to almost double. And as you probably know, water bills have gone up almost 120% in a decade. So that makes Detroit as a city one of the highest paying water paying places in the nation. The problem with that is that Detroit buys its water as individual households. The suburbs buy the water as municipalities. And so the municipalities then make their charges to their residents at a different rate. So what you have are differential water rates where people in Detroit are paying sometimes $150, $200, $300 water bills, and people in Livonia for the very same water are paying $11 water bills. And you can see that disparity in the graph that was done in the Mapping the Water Crisis, but it's a dramatic difference.
So, what happened with bankruptcy?
Well, the water department was not terribly effective. It was not terribly well funded. People frequently fell behind on their water bills. In the bankruptcy process, one of the first things that happened is that the day before the emergency manager took power, the federal court released the water department from federal oversight, which meant that it could then immediately be listed as an asset in the Detroit bankruptcy process. And within, I think, 2 days after taking office, Kevin Orr, the emergency manager, announced that he was going to put the water department up for sale as a way to solve some of the bankruptcy questions. Once he did that, this then raised the question of, should water departments be privately owned or should they be publicly owned? That was the first question. The second question was, if he was going to sell it, what would that require? And there were two directions. One, Wall Street firms and businesses that were looking at the water department said it would be more attractive if he could get rid of the outstanding payments on water bills. And so that desire to get rid of bad debt to the water department essentially fueled an aggressive shut-off campaign. So the original notion for shut-offs was to make the water department more attractive for sale. Given the racial dynamics in the area, the suburbanites jumped on that notion and said, before we do any kind of regionalization of the water as an alternative to private sale, we need to know that none of our pure suburban customers will be paying for any water for those deadbeat Detroiters. That was kind of the discourse going on. So as a result, you had twin pressures on the emergency manager to do water shutoffs. One from the notion of sale, and two from the notion of suburbanites who were considering some kind of public-private partnership. So that was the impetus, to make it more attractive as a commodity, without any discussion of human rights or public trust.
How did you receive the news? Because by that time you were already very much involved with the community organizing community over here. So, can you describe a little bit about how this news broke around you and how the organizing community responded?
Well, we were already organizing almost for a year around the consent agreement. Prior to the emergency manager, there had been a consent agreement, and I think our slogan was not very inventive, but it was no consent. And so we were already recognizing the push to bankruptcy. And in that, I think the way the news broke about the water department was the call for proposals for sale, which it happened very, very quickly. The call was public, but the response to the call, I don't know if it's ever been made public, because emergency managers do not operate with any conventions around transparency. So I think one of the corporations was Veolia, but I don't know as we ever heard specifically of, I think it was 36 separate bids were offered for the water department. And of course the suburban politicians had an interest in those bids because they didn't want the water department to be totally privatized either. That would jeopardize their water rates. So they wanted some control over the water rates. But I think it just broke in the newspaper. I don't think there was any announcement of any kind. But we were all very concerned because it talked about the need to get rid of the bad debt of the water department. And we know people have been, since, as you mentioned earlier, people have been struggling with water bills since the early 2000s.
So then what did you do?
Well, the first thing we did was organize protests. I know I wrote about it. At that time I was writing a weekly column for the Michigan Citizen. And so I started writing about it. We started organizing. The People's Water Board, almost within days, started getting calls about trucks coming into the neighborhood and shutting people off. And this was a fairly aggressive campaign of shutoffs that violated conventional experience in Detroit. In the past, if somebody was coming in to shut off your water, they would knock on your door, they would tell you that, they would have appropriate paperwork. If you had already gone down to the water department to make arrangements, you know, there was a much more civil and humane process. But with these haulage trucks, they were in some cases people traveling through the community. They would start at one end of the block and go straight up the street. And so the People's Water Board was getting phone calls about water shutoffs. Sometimes people had paid bills. Frequently, because one of the other dynamics in the city is that people who used to own homes had lost their homes and were now renting, often from absentee landlords. And so we had apartment buildings where folks had been paying their water bill only to discover that the landlord had not been forwarding it to the water department. So you'd have whole apartment buildings shut off where everyone had paid, and there was no mechanism to respond to any of this. The city hadn't put anything in place to help people with shutoffs. There'd been nothing put in place to help with back payment of bills. It was just shut them off, get them off the system, show we're financially responsible. So that our original response was out of emergency calls that people were receiving at the People's Water Board and We the People of Detroit, who had organized around resisting bankruptcy.
How did that pan out? Because, you know, bankruptcy then moved on to was finally resolved in 2013. 2014 was when it was finalized. And we've pretty much had shutoffs in all of those years during bankruptcy and since beyond as well. Can you provide a sort of a bird's eye view of what you're seeing in terms of how the shutoffs have progressed?
Well, before we go to
Yeah.
how the shutoffs have progressed, I think there are a couple of important things. One is the shutoffs immediately after bankruptcy reached almost 100,000 people. The United Nations came in, investigated the bankruptcies, or not the bankruptcy, investigated the shutoffs, and the United Nations declared that this was a human rights violation, that these were being done without any effort to support people. The next thing to think about is that we launched a court fight during bankruptcy to try and get the judge to initiate a moratorium on shutoffs. The judge acknowledged that there were clear human rights violations, clear dangers to people, but said straight up, there is no human right to water. And the financial concerns of the city are what are primary in my decision making. That's what he said. So that clued us to another strategy that had to emerge, which ultimately took the place. Stephanie Chang has led the fight on this, of trying to create at the state level a legal framework to enshrine water as a human right and a public trust. And former Congressman John Conyers took that fight to the federal level, because what this revealed was, even when you could show demonstrable harm to people, that's not enough to protect water as a human right. So there was both a legal court strategy and now an effort at the legislative level to shift that. And that came out during the bankruptcy process. And I think the final thing is that the major thing that brought attention to the water struggle were not the shutoffs, but they were the public demonstrations and the public gatherings around them. And one of the things that was documented by We the People in their book, Mapping the Water Crisis, is every time there was a major public demonstration, shutoffs would drop down. So those are things that came out during the bankruptcy. The landscape afterward has revealed a couple of things. One is the mayor's effort to create a water assistance plan is a dismal failure. First, the numbers of people who cannot pay their water bill continues to expand. And what's happening is not only was the original pool of money insufficient, but when people sign up for this original pool of money, they end up falling behind. Yes, okay, you get your water shut back on in June, come August, you're behind again. So it's a vicious cycle going backward. The other thing about the current landscape is that while these shutoffs are happening, they are happening in a context that has become in some ways much more dire, because through the bankruptcy and probably the subsequent year or so after, school systems were able to provide support for families. Many schools were opening early so kids could come in and get water, they could wash up, they could take showers in the gym. There was a real effort by schools, as often happens in Detroit during social collapse. Often the schools become sort of that last line of defense to protect children. And of course, now a year ago, that literally dried up because the school water is contaminated. So the landscape in the city, on the one hand, is dire, and in some cases more dire. On the other hand, this recent Haas report has been a very good new opening for conversations at the policy level in the city about water and water affordability. And part of that is because it ties water affordability to the notion that the city might have been taken for yet another ride by the suburbs, because the suburbs only are paying $50 million a year for the water, and the Haas report says it probably should be more like $250 to $300 million a year. So that disparity has caught the city's attention. So hopeful, and I understand, I haven't seen anything publicly about the Blue Ribbon Commission that the mayor has just appointed to look at water, but we're hopeful that this will move us closer to this notion of water affordability. Because the reality is Detroiters are not getting any richer.
So let's talk about the Great Lakes Water Authority and GLEWA. And how the formation, what does the formation of GLEWA mean for water access and distribution?
Well, I'm not a fan of the Great Lakes Water Authority. One would hope that people would have some larger perspective about the Great Lakes and about the fragility of the water systems that we share in that basin. But the Great Lakes Water Authority does not appear to operate with any broader sense of where it gets its name, the Great Lakes, nor does it appear to operate with anything other than an emphasis on authority. And that authority means that the decision-making of the Great Lakes Water Authority is primarily in the hands of a majority suburban interests. Now, if there was a shared convention or a shared understanding of water as a human right, if there was a real affordability plan in the city, that would not be a problem, I don't think. The problem is that decisions about water in the larger sense are being made by people who have essentially racist and disrespectful notions about people in the city. So you have created a system where something that is essential to life is under the control of people who don't respect the life in the city. And that creates all kinds of problems, including ever escalating water bills and continual blocking of a water affordability plan that would be based on income rather than use. There is, I think, a philosophical question as well about whether or not these sort of public-private notions are a good way to go around the control of water. And it's unclear to me at this stage that the Great Lakes Water Authority has any sense of the dimensions of the danger to the water supply, whether we begin at the top of Michigan with line 5 all the way down through all the PFAS flowing in from the several both Air Force Base along the water and looking at the interior bases. The question of what sort of controls there are on runoff, all of those are major issues that I'm not sure the Great Lakes Water Authority has any intention of addressing. I haven't seen a single statement, for example, from the Great Lakes Water Authority about the dangers of this pipeline that clearly put at risk all of our water supply that goes to all almost 4.5 million people if anything should happen to that pipeline in northern Michigan. But they seem to think that's somehow disconnected from them. So there's that issue. And so I think the Great Lakes Water Authority is not something that shows any real effort to address the two fundamental questions raised by the Detroit water struggle, which is water a human right? Is it a sacred trust? And if you answer yes to those, how does that shift your sense of policy and process?
Do you think most people are even aware of the fact that GLEWA pretty much now is in charge of the water distribution and rate setting for most residents, or do they still associate it with DWSD?
Well, I think most people, and in part this is because of the confusion the mayor pushes, most people think that the Detroit Water and Sewage Department is in charge of things, which obviously they're not. And the mayor likes to talk about how independent they are, but all you have to do is look at the efforts of the city council to limit rate increases in water and see that it just takes the hint that they might actually exercise authority to have people say, oh, we've got emergency managers here if you guys aren't careful. So this effort to diminish the city's capacity for self-determination is in some ways enshrined in GLEWA, but I don't think most people recognize that.
There seems
Because
to be
it's complicated. It's not easy to
Yeah. Would it be fair to say that there's a lack of trust presently with DWSD and with GLEWA?
Well, I don't know if there's a lack of trust. I think they are predictably unfriendly to residents. I think that's what people expect. People do not think going to pay your water bill is a fun time. People do not think that they receive good customer care. People do not believe that the bills are accurate. Part of our organizing around the shutoffs was to go to the water stations where people were paying their water bills, and within 3 minutes, people would come up to us and say, I want to tell my story. Here's my $1,000 water bill. I've been trying for 2 years, they would say, to get the city to fix this. And now they're telling me it's a shutoff. So I think what people trust is that the water department won't help them very much.
Switching gears a little bit, let's talk about the Boggs Center, which is a long and storied history in the region. How is the Boggs Center involved in this ongoing issue of water?
Well, the Boggs Center emphasizes two things. One, the importance of creating visionary alternatives to the crisis that we face. And two, the importance of place-based organizing. And we joined in the resistance to emergency management because we thought it violated both of those efforts. And so our primary emphasis has been to do everything we can to work with people. We're a member of the People's Water Board, for example, but to work with people to push this notion of a real water affordability plan based on income. Because we think that is the most responsible way to ensure that water as a human right is enacted. The second thing we've done is we have very much encouraged the development of an alternative thinking about water, so that we've encouraged in urban gardens, for example, water catchment systems. We have long argued that rain gardens should be a part of city policy, much like the city of Milwaukee has done, where residents, by building rain gardens, are able to get money from the city off their water bills because they are participating in a program to help with runoff. We've long argued that the use of gray water and different kinds of water systems for not just gardens but for other activities would be a wise thing to do. So we've tried to push this notion of alternatives. And then I guess our third effort in that is to try to publicize as much as we can so that other people can see these alternatives as a way to go. So for example, in the Riverwise magazine that we helped put out, one of our stories is about the Brightmoor bicycles, where the kids figured out how to do a rainwater filtration system while pedaling their bicycles and charging the electric battery to run it. So those are really visionary, imaginative ways to think about how to get water to people.
So how do you do this? You talk about disrupting understandings and pushing for alternative frames. Do you do this through workshops? Do you do this through community meetings? Do you do this through lobbying? Can you maybe recount a few recent events or programs that you did initiate?
Well, the Boggs Center primarily emphasizes ideas in written form. We write and publish and put out leaflets, put out magazines, put out books chapters, So there's a whole written element of it. We do a weekly newsletter that includes these kinds of ideas that we're talking about. We hold public meetings, we hold events, we participate in workshops and other public meetings around the city. We host workshops. This coming June and July, we're acknowledging the 100th anniversary of James Boggs, whose writing about technology was some of the first writing in the country, being critical of the use of technology over human activities. And so we're going to spend about 5 days with teach-in, what we're calling teach-ins and workshops and block parties and a whole series of publications that will go along with that. But it's an effort to put out ideas around different ways of thinking about where we are today and where we want to go. One of the things I said just yesterday is in 1973, when I met James Boggs, the very first question he asked me is, what are you thinking about the 21st century? And I thought, most people, if they were thinking at all far ahead, would say, what are you thinking about 1984, because of Orwell's book? And Jimmy was already in the 21st century. And though he died long before we got there, that notion of how do we think about the future is part of what's critical to the Boggs Center. So when we talk about visionary organizing, one of the things we're really asking, and what are the forms of conversation, of writing, of ideas that get us to see we have a responsibility not just for today and not just to fix what was wrong yesterday, but where are we going to be in the next 30 years? Where will human beings want to live? And so how do we think about that systematically for 30 years and 50 years and 100 years down the road?
As part of that broader agenda, something that you have highlighted repeatedly in our conversations is the need to enable people, community members, to tell their own story. And you do this primarily through Riverwise as well as through some other forums. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, just yesterday at a Riverwise meeting, we were talking about the theme for the upcoming Riverwise, which will be for the summer of 2019. I guess that's where we're at, summer of 2019. And yes, here it is. This is Riverwise. See, look at that. What do you think of that? Look at the back. Pretty cool, huh? So what we were saying about the theme is Detroit wants to be seen, not watched. And what we're trying to do is create this notion of Detroit. Much of the life of Detroit is not seen by the dominant culture and certainly not carried in the mainstream media. What does get carried in the mainstream media is this notion that we're all living in terribly victimized circumstances and we need to be watched via the green light program and the surveillance programs, all of that effort to control people as a way to try and position us as people that are not going to rise up and raise questions of, let's say, water affordability. So that notion of Detroit wants to be seen but not watched is an effort to say there are stories on the street, like the Brightmoor young people. These are high school kids in a community school who created a water filtration system that could be used almost anywhere in the world and provide safe drinking water. You would think that kind of story would be on the front page of a newspaper to say, look at the brilliance in this community, but it's not. So that's a story that we insist on telling. And it's a story that is replicated in many, many ways. Just yesterday at the meeting, since we were talking about community issues, the guy who distributes some of the Riverwise has written an article, and it's called Just Walk Away. And it's the story of his experience as a man who was married for 35 years, saying, I do not understand why anyone would engage in hitting their partner. What is this? what kind of person are you that you would do that? And he raises really interesting questions about when we feel anger emerging, how do we deal with that? Now that's a conversation that people have all over the place, but no one takes that in the mainstream media as a serious conversation that should be elevated as a way for us to think about, why aren't we learning to just walk away when we get angry? What's going on with us? How do we learn to think about that differently? So practices of restorative justice, practices of de-escalation of violence, all of those are things that are happening at the community level. They get almost zero coverage as a story being told. And instead what you hear are stories of carjackings or some kind of crime in the community. So you have a situation where what the mainstream media and the corporate powers are doing is trying to accelerate our fear of one another. And we think by telling the stories of imagination, of creativity, of care, what we encourage is our understanding of our connection to each other.
Can we stop